Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you for the opportunity to come and speak on a non-Sloan subject. And also, I'm actually grateful to you for kind of pushing me in this direction, because this was not exactly in my frame of reference, so it kind of pushed me to rethink some ideas, which I'll talk about. This is such a wonderful occasion to see this extraordinary exhibition and all of these works that we never get to see. And I do have one brief Helen Sloan story, and that was when I first met her in the early 90s when I was working on my first Henri show. And I could see she was a little miffed that I wasn't working on Sloan, and was kind of saying, like, why are you working on Henri? There's so much work done on Henri. But anyway, she was very gracious and very helpful. Okay. In these cyclical episodes of nationalism, it seems especially timely to reconsider this idea amid the cries of "Make America Great Again" that come from within this country, whose foundation is really a stew based on immigration and outside influences, as I think we've seen in some of the other papers. And it's interesting to note the nationalistic strains that were also heard within the art world during the early 20th century, both before and after World War I, as this country was trying to establish its own artistic identity and locate its place among longer established cultural traditions, especially from Europe. Robert Henri, influential painter, teacher, and close lifelong friend of John Sloan, figured prominently in this promotion of an American art. And yet personally, he held a broad international outlook in terms of his own art and career, even down to the way he presented himself as a continental dandy in his younger days, as you see here. And he was always very charismatic and very stylish, even on a very limited budget. I mean, you can sense a real sense of his self. The theme of this symposium led me to consider these two strains, nationalism and internationalism, that colored and informed Henri's art and ideas. It's an interesting subject that led me to reconsider a different way of framing Henri's development as an artist through the lens of his promotion of and desire for establishing art that was uniquely American, and which seems a contradiction to his own cosmopolitan tendencies. Henri made repeated and pointed nationalistic references to the creation of a distinctly American art and the need for establishing America as an art center throughout his extensive writings and class instruction. Yet he also pursued a very different, far-reaching approach in his training and practice that profoundly impacted the direction of his own artistic production, the likenesses of various ethnic and regional types for which he is best known. On an obvious level, these paths appear to be antithetical, so consequently, I will explore and attempt to reconcile these disparate perspectives and how they're manifested within Henri's writings, teachings, and ideas. As the noted scholar William Innes Homer pointed out in his book on Henri came out of two major currents, one that valued native or national American traditions, and the other that favored international conventions inspired by European art. Homer credited Henri as the central motivating force for artistic progress of his generation and the leading channel through which recent innovations for European painting were transmitted to the US. Henri asserted that America must nurture an art of its own, drawing upon its essential qualities, which to him did not mean that European art should be rejected, but that it should instead be used for whatever value it might have in fostering the expression of a distinct American value. Henri was an artist who was American to the core, born in Nebraska, lived in Ohio, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York, But he was a man of the world, an inveterate traveler and painter, and he was a student of art history beyond national boundaries. Starting with his own education, he studied extensively in Europe, primarily in France, first at the Académie Julienne, as we've seen, and seeking and finally obtaining entree to the prestigious but too regimented Académie des Beaux-Arts, where he remained only very briefly. He spent considerable time in Europe, in France primarily in his younger years, in stays from 1888 through 91, 1894 to 97, and 1898 to 1900, all of which unquestionably informed the development of his art and ideas. He believed in the old method of copying works by the European old masters to learn from their mastery and technique. In 1900, on a visit to Spain, he reproduced 5 of Diego Velázquez's masterworks in the Prado, working to scale within the galleries, something which obviously would no longer be allowed. As you see here in one example, his copy of Queen Mariana of Austria. And do note the size, because this is monumental. About this practice, he declared the value of it, saying, "If I had known, I would have come here to the Prado long ago to have and bring home these copies, to have them at hand. It would be so great an advantage to be able to make comparisons of what I do myself with the copies of the Velázquez." As a teacher, Henri took classes from the New York School of Art on trips abroad, leading groups to Spain in 1906 and 8, and to Holland, where he went to Haarlem, Volendam, and Amsterdam in 1907, and again back to Spain in 1912. The 2 masters he most admired, Velázquez and Frans Hals, were the focus of these trips. His objective was to intimately school these students in the styles and techniques they could pick up by close viewing and analysis, taking his students daily to the museums to study the paintings of the masters. His students later sent him postcards when they returned to these various destinations, recalling the paintings they'd seen and what he had taught them. And the other image is a sketch by Henri's second wife, Marjorie Organ, who was a noted illustrator. And this is just a picture of Randall Davy and her husband relaxing after a long day of teaching class. Randall Davy accompanied Henri on the 1912 trip to Spain and sort of served as his assistant. So at the same time, Henri was advocating for new American art. He was also very much tied to historic European precedents, traveling abroad and instilling in his students the more old world approach of appreciation for the importance of European artistic traditions. Individuality and freedom of expression became constant refrains throughout Henri's teaching, writing, and efforts in organizing independent exhibitions, forsaking the strictures and conventions of the art establishment and the Academy's restrictive stance. His ideas took shape very early on, from the 1890s, when he lived in Philadelphia and held these social gatherings and critiques in the Walnut and Chestnut Street studios for fellow artists that included Sloan, George Lukes, Everett Shinn, and William Glackens. So here you just see images dating to that period. And building upon that, he instigated a series of independent exhibitions starting in 1901, leading up to the 1908 exhibition of the 8 American artists at Macbeth Gallery, that then traveled to quite a number of cities and received tremendous publicity. And with that, Henri's credentials as a leader in a progressive realist movement that was brash, original, and uniquely American was clear. This is underscored by the newspaper headlines you see here, indicating how startling it was that these artists dared to paint New York instead of Europe. Henri's ideas about defining a national art were codified and presented publicly through a sequence of texts he authored, ideas that were distilled from extensive letters he wrote and taken from his classroom teachings. He was gifted with words and sort of a great sweeping drama of ideas, and he painted with a very broad brush in his paintings as well as in his texts. The first major article he published that encapsulated many concepts that he reiterated throughout his life appeared in January 1909 in the journal The Craftsman, entitled, again very theatrically, "Progress in our national art must spring from the development of individuality of ideas and freedom of expression, a suggestion for a new art school." The text was likely commissioned by his lifelong friend and supporter, the critic and editor Mary Fenton Roberts, who also occasionally published under the pseudonym Giles Edgerton, and whose likeness you see here in a portrait sketch of her by John Butler Yeats, father of the poet and a friend and part of their social set. In the article, Henri advocated for advancing art in America through educational means, but he qualified it by indicating that a national art is not limited to a question of subject or of technique, but a real understanding of the fundamental conditions personal to a country, and then the relation of the individual to these conditions. And so what is necessary for art in America is first an appreciation of the great ideas native to the country, and then the achievement of a masterly freedom in expressing them. He expanded on the concept of nationalism with regard to the individual, asserting that, and so the American painter with brain and brush liberated by the greatest possible self-development is just as certain to express the quality of the country as he is in himself to present an American type or speak the language of his native land, positing that, as American artists, their point of view would always be American. But despite that premise, whenever he was able, Henri sought out international locales, influences, and subjects. Yet he concluded that in the end, it is not so much the actual place or the immediate environment where one paints. It is personal freedom. And it's actually this very premise of artistic freedom that formed the core underpinning of Henri's ideology that he consistently maintained throughout his life. The following year, he wrote about the monumental 1910 exhibition of independent artists with which he was closely involved. With regard to that effort, he reasserted ideas similar to those he had previously articulated, writing, "As I see it, there is only one reason for the development of an art in America, and that is that the people of America learn the means of expressing themselves in their own time and in their own land." He held up Sloan, William Glackens, and Rockwell Kent among the multitude of artists who exhibited as exemplifying an ideal of an American artist. And here you see works by Henri and Sloan that were exhibited in the exhibition. 5 years later, in 1915, Henri's most often quoted article, "My People," first appeared in print, again published under the auspices of Mary Fenton Roberts and The Craftsman. Here he brings up artistic patriotism, a point that continues to resonate. However, he dispels the idea of dominance of one culture over another, as he professed, "I am patriotic only about what I admire, and my devotion burns as brightly for Europe as for America, and I do not contrast civilizations." And 10 years after that, in a subsequent article entitled, "What About Art in America?" for the journal Arts and Decoration, that Mary Fenton Roberts was then overseeing, he tackled defining America's place within an international context. Roberts was clearly his co-conspirator in promoting his brand of American art. And the following passage that I'm going to read from that article is to me stunningly prescient in light of all that's occurred since it appeared in print in 1925, as he astutely forecasted a burgeoning globalism he perceived even at that time that seems so relevant and contemporary. As to a distinct American art, we know there has been a Greek art, a French art, a Spanish art in the past, but in the future, it will not again be possible to have these distinctly separate arts, because we here in America and people all over the world are no longer living within the confines of their own geographical barriers, but we are in touch with everything that is going on. Today, through the great facilities of contact that exist, we are able to know what is being achieved at present in the world. We should be able to realize that the art of today cannot be confined to nations, but must be, without barriers, a world art. Henri became a standard bearer for artistic freedom and independence, which I suggest ultimately even overshadows either nationalism or internationalism for him. In 1928, Creative Art, the magazine for fine and applied art, published an article that posed the question, should American artists go abroad to study? And it was posed to 24 contemporary artists of wide-ranging aesthetic orientation. Henri's response, which led the article, was distilled from a letter he had written to Rockwell Kent earlier that year, in which he advocated that it should be individual prerogative that guides this decision. However, he also contended that how could it hurt? As he wrote, let him, meaning the art student, go if he wants to. He should settle the question for himself. It does not matter. Originality is as hard as a diamond. If one has it, a trip or even a long stay abroad can't cut into it. I know that the contrary idea is prevalent, but why not go abroad? See all the museums over there, see all the people, mix with the great crowds. When he comes home, he will still be himself, an American as much as he ever was, and with a plus of experience. Henri's central belief was in the strength of the individual and their creativity, asserting that an artist will not lose that identity through experiences and exposure to outside influences. He had always endorsed embracing life experience to the fullest, which he felt translated into art, as he stated, art cannot be separated from life. And as he declared on more than one occasion, I'm not interested in any one school or movement, nor do I care for art as art. I am interested in life. Interestingly, although Henri preached a rather laissez-faire attitude about studying abroad, and despite his lifelong championing of a distinctive American art, he himself followed a very different path, going abroad for education and seeking inspiration there at every opportunity. And of the utmost importance in formulating his own direction was his study of the European Old Masters, most notably in the Louvre, the Prado, and other museums throughout Europe, especially Holland. And this was likely key in his quest for seeking out and painting likenesses of cultural and ethnic types, and in striving for authenticity, at least his brand of authenticity. The prologue to this practice began in 1904 in his New York studio, as he dressed a model of Spanish heritage as a Spanish dancer, from which he composed a large-scale likeness, convincing in its ethnicity, which when publicly shown earned him great accolades. But once he was able to return to Europe, he focused on painting genuine subjects in their native land, launching him into his exploration of international types, first in Spain in 1906, seen here in his first true Spanish gypsy, La Trinidad, followed by Holland in 1907, seen here in Dutch Girl, Laughing Child, and finally Ireland, beginning in 1913, seen here with Irish Girl. There are few other artists for whom international travel had more significance to their art and career than for Robert Henri. Travel was a vital ingredient in his creative process, since his art was experiential, deriving from his direct engagement with the subject, his widely varied international destinations, directly and profoundly informed and shaped his artistic choices. Wanderlust was apparently part of his makeup, and his sojourns were frequent and far-reaching. And a survey of his production reveals that a major body of work was defined by these chosen foreign locales, since he worked directly from life. These places and the individuals he encountered unquestionably influenced how and what he would paint, falling into discrete periods that correlate to his peripatetic travels. The sojourns also expanded Henri's intellectual and artistic horizons and offered up a more expansive worldview to him that coalesced along with his humanistic philosophy as he turned toward depicting the varied types for which he became known. Despite his enduring promotion of American art, Henri continued the practice of studying the great European masters even well into his mature years. When he went to Spain in 1923 and 4, at the age of 58, he still went daily and spent hours studying the works in the Prado, even after all the time he had previously spent there. He extolled its value to the Sloans in a 1924 letter he wrote, saying, "The Prado is a wonder. Nowhere are there more wonderful or more perfectly seen pictures." And his wife Marjorie reported to another friend and former Henri student, Helen Niles, about how they spent their days. "The Prado got the greater part of our time. Almost every afternoon we were there from 3 to 5, and often we spent the morning there too." It's indeed remarkable that despite so many years of continual study, he was still looking at European antecedents, as his appreciation for the old masters, in particular Velázquez, never diminished. As he wrote George Bellows, "That Velázquez is as great a master as anyone ever thought he was." Among his close circle, Bellows and Sloan in particular, however, never traveled abroad. Sloan expressed an interest in foreign travel in his early years, especially to Paris, which was undoubtedly in part inspired by Henri's enthusiasm. However, financial constraints never made it feasible, and Gloucester, Massachusetts, and northern New Mexico ultimately displaced his artistic attention from the teens on. And Bellows avidly studied the work of old masters in books and museums while remaining stateside. Others in Henri's circle, such as Edward Hopper, Rockwell Kent, Guy Pendubois, William Glackens, Leon Kroll, and Eugene Spiker, all traveled abroad to varying extents and assimilated international ideas and influences. But as Henri noted, each exemplified a truly American artist. For Henri personally, travel and international influences were essential. Travel abroad provided the freedom from a multitude of obligations and distractions and fed his need for inspiration and subject matter in his pursuit of his people, as he set forth in his 1915 Craftsman article, and also in his 1923 book, The Art Spirit, which was derived from his classroom instruction. He further explained this need to travel in a 1926 letter to synchromist Morgan Russell, where he wrote that, "I personally value a shift of place considerably. The change has its value in getting away from things, getting free. One country is as good as another." But another perspective, as Sloan mused later in life in his book Gist of Art, was that perhaps internationalism and the significance of what lies beyond the national boundary was overemphasized. As Sloan wrote, "I have never been outside the United States, but while I have seen few of the masterpieces of the past, perhaps I agree with the Chinese philosopher who said that if you stayed in one spot, all the world would come to you." This a viewpoint that is congruent with other inimitably American artists, such as George Bellows and Andrew Wyeth, for example, whose interests were exclusively focused within the national borders, is also compatible with Henri's belief that either way, one would still be an American artist. So in reconciling the two strains of nationalism and internationalism, Henri was reported as relating to his art students a quote for which I have a special fondness. "American art can be produced just as well in Spain as New Jersey. If seen through American eyes, it is American art." Thank you.